I'm back. Who was here first? Humble thinker. He's always here first, it seems like. Hey, welcome, Mrs. Apostate. Chen. Eleanor Voss. Are you new? I don't remember seeing your name here before. Let's go, PineCreek, says Justin. Okay, this is incredible to me, this video we're about to watch. You know how many apologists say that it's because of the overwhelming evidence that they became Christians? It's not true. Not true. Even for guys like, what's his name? Well, you're going to hear from J. Warner Wallace, but what's the guy's name? The biggest apologist bookseller in the United States. What's his name? He was the drunkard, and his wife took him to church, and he became a Christian. I'm drawing a blank. He is in cahoots with Mark Middleberg. Someone help me out here. But yeah, same with him. He was a drunkard, and he needed something. He needed a change in his life. And then he spent 2 years researching and decided, you know what? Christianity is true. Lee Strobel, thank you. You know what? I'm actually glad I couldn't think of his name. That's a good thing, I think. But yeah, Lee Strobel. And, you look at guys like Jeff Durbin. He was a drug addict and almost died. Even guys like that Pentecostal apologist, Michael Brown, same thing, drug addict, almost died. Wife was in the church, girlfriends lead him to church. It's the PineCreek theorem is, I think, alive and well, that women have led more men to Jesus than the Holy Spirit could ever do. Rick Warren. No, I wasn't thinking of Rick Warren, but yeah, they kind of look alike, Rick Warren and Lee Strobel. Yeah, and I doubt if it was 2 years that Lee Strobel, I think he says it was closer to a year and a half. But what ends up happening, and this is my theory, my theory is they have some type of experience, or they have a need, a deep psychological need. And I'm not saying we all have needs. We all have deep psychological needs. But what ends up happening is they convert to Christianity, and they then justify their beliefs, because they kind of do feel a little foolish for believing this stuff. The gospel is foolishness for those who are perishing, of course. But even Christians feel a little bit of foolishness about what they believe. And so they desperately, I'll use the word desperately, try to find out ways to make this make sense. And say, well, look at the evidence is just so overwhelming, and we have all these arguments, and we have a cumulative case. But it's because that they feel the need to bolster their case is why they do it for themselves, number one, and then if you become an apologist, they sell books. I really don't think, some people are maybe going to disagree with me on this one, but I don't think it's the case of that they're just trying to make money. I think for most of the time, at least they start out really deeply believing this stuff and seeking out answers, seeking out evidence to confirm what they already believe. Confirmation bias. And then later on they realize, hey, I can make money doing this. I can quit my job doing whatever. And there's going to be old farts with money who are going to pay me money, I'm speaking on behalf of the apologists, to protect our kids. Protect our kids from what? Well, it's a terrible thing to leave Christianity, apparently. You know that I've been watching a few shows on the backlash of what Rhett and Link. And the question that just keeps popping in my mind is, Christians, do you seriously think that Rhett and Link are going to be horrible people now that they left Christianity? Do you think they're going to do horrible things to their spouses, to their friends, to society in general? here's a little clue. They're not going to be bad people, relatively speaking, just because they left Christianity. Christianity is not needed to be a good person. You don't even need it to justify being a good person. What it boils down to is heaven and hell, and this is especially for evangelical types, and this is why they get scared. Okay, now this, I'll hit play here, and this boggles my mind. This is J. Warner Wallace. For those of you who don't know who this guy is, he is a detective, cold case homicide detective, and he sells books showing, look, the evidence for Jesus is just as good, if not better, than a lot of his cold cases, and so therefore you should believe it.
10 minutes. That sound good? I'm here, as they said, serving with Operation Heal Our Patriots. It's been great fun for me to do that. I come from Los Angeles County, where I've been working cold cases, and I've learned a lot along the way. And I'm going to share with you something today that people ask me to talk about a lot that I never like to talk about. And so I don't ever talk about it publicly. But I do want to talk about it with you, and you'll see why in a minute. People ask me all the time to share, would you tell me what your personal, quote-unquote, testimony is? So I'm going to just tell you what my journey was.
Okay, so I thought his personal testimony was that he didn't believe in Christianity, and then he started to research the evidence and became a Christian, right? Isn't that kind of what he's led us to believe? That because of his skills as a detective, that's the reason why he's a Christian today?
I was raised in Southern California, and in Los Angeles County, it is so dense from a population perspective that you could live your entire life there and really not come in contact with Christians. And that's the way I grew up. I didn't know any Christians. We were no Christians in our family. My dad's a very stubborn atheist, and I'm very close to my dad.
I always have a question mark in my mind when you live in the United States of America. And granted, it's LA, but still, when you live in the United States of America, do you not turn on the TV and see Christians, even Christian politicians? Like when I hear someone say, I never knew Christians growing up. Am I wrong to call BS on that?
I've been doing the same work that he did. He was at our agency for 28 years. I followed him. I was there 25. My son's been there about 8. So we've been at the same agency for 58 years. And I just followed in his footsteps. Didn't know any Christians. Now, my wife was raised as more of a cultural Catholic, but she had no idea she didn't own a Bible. But when
Your wife did not own a Bible.
we started having kids, she said, should we bring our kids to church? I'm like, no. She says, well, we should at least expose them to this. I said, well, if you want, I'll be happy to go. Okay. My dad will go to church.
You know, you see this often. You'll actually even see this. You'll have a husband and wife. They're not religious at all. They have kids. And once you know it, the whole idea of community becomes attractive, and going to church becomes attractive, and they start to buy into it. So one way to allay the fears of so many Christians today, all these kids are leaving, all the youth are leaving Christianity. This is horrible. Well, just wait till they have kids. And there's a chance, I don't know what the stats are, but it could be as high as a third will end up going back. And it's mostly for community reasons.
With you, he thinks it's a very useful delusion. He thinks it has useful principles for raising kids. I thought, okay, I'll do that too. I'd be happy to do that. So I went to church with her, and I sat in an evangelical church for the first time for anything other than a wedding or a funeral. And this pastor was clever enough to say that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived.
Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. A pastor said that. I was trying to figure out which church this was and which pastor said that. And the closest thing I can get to is the Gospel Coalition started, I think, was it Tim Keller? A Tim Keller type church. And so, but that's a great line to get to a person who thinks that they themselves is smart, and then to say, oh, Jesus was the smartest person who ever lived. And so if you don't know anything about Christianity, now your interest is piqued, right?
I thought. He even said that upon the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, maybe in like 1 or 2 sermons, all of Western civilization has been founded. I thought, that's not true. So I bought a Bible. I spent $6 on a Pew Bible. Okay, I didn't want to spend a lot of money on this. And I started to read through it to see if that was, I want to get the wisdom statement, the red words, the red letters of Jesus. What did he really say that was so darn smart?
Notice at this point, he didn't question whether the red letters were actually Jesus' words. Didn't question when they were written, by whom they were written at this point. He just took it for granted at this point that when you open up the Bible and you read the red letters, whoa, this is what a man named Jesus actually said 2,000 years ago. Someone who's critically minded wouldn't just assume that's the case.
And as I realized this, I said, as I'm reading through it, it struck me that it resembled the kinds of eyewitness accounts I worked, especially in cold cases. I don't have access to the original eyewitnesses. Sometimes 35 years later, they're dead. I don't even have access to the people who wrote the reports about the original eyewitnesses because those guys are dead. So I'm looking at reports of eyewitness accounts in which I have no access to the eyewitness.
Like, call me crazy, but when I hear the phrase eyewitness accounts, I at least expect to know who we're talking about. Like, if someone says, oh, there's an eyewitness account of you, Doug, doing something. Oh, well, who is it? Who's the account from? Well, we don't know. Well, then why is it an eyewitness account? Well, we guess we know, but it's not for sure we know who it's from. Well, where is it? Is it a recording? No, it's written down in a book. Well, when was the book written? I don't know. We have an idea. Like, this whole idea that a guy like J. Warner Wallace could convict someone of something really important using this type of evidence, it blows my mind. And, well, we'll get there.
Witness or the report writer. What's that sound like to you? Those are the Gospels. So I'm reading through this and I thought, wow, this actually has a texture that I was intrigued by. So I started to investigate this using the template that I know I use to determine if eyewitnesses are reliable. I even use something called forensic statement analysis. We have bad guys actually write out, when I interview them, I'll have them take a piece of paper.
So bad guys writing stuff out. So you already know that they're bad guys, and you're just like this experiment that he's talking about right now, you could never do with the gospel writers.
On one side only, 12 lines, sometimes 24, and they'll have a pen, and they write out everything they did on the day of the murder from the time they woke up to the time they went to bed. And I will analyze that looking for deception indicators.
Yeah, and you know who this person is. You can actually watch them write it. You can have them go back and write it again if you want. Can't do that with the Gospels.
How they compress time, how they expand time, how they use pronouns, how they use tenses and verbs. And I'm looking for things, adjectives and adverbs are really important. Optional words are really important. And I'll use that process to determine if they're lying to me before we even have the interview. At least I'll know what I have to focus on in the interview. So I started to use forensic statement analysis on the Gospels to see if I could find the deception that I'm...
Now remember, he's talking about why he doesn't share his testimony. But this is not his testimony that he's saying right now.
Expecting to find. In the end, I realized this is a reliable account of Jesus of Nazareth. And it bothered me. But I found myself compelled to... And I was delighted to find that Jesus of Nazareth is an incredibly evidential person. We are not asked to believe this blindly. You recognize that Jesus would go...
We're not asked to believe this blindly, but yet Jesus has been purported to have said that blessed are those who believe without seeing.
Go into towns, and he would heal before he would herald. Ever notice that? You heal first, then you start preaching. Why? Because he said in John, if you don't believe the words that I just gave you, at least believe on the evidence of the miracles I worked in front of you.
Now, I wonder how consistent J. Warner Wallace is here. Because he didn't see these healings. Nobody on this planet right now has ever seen Jesus heal. I'm talking with the fleshy Jesus. You basically have to take it that the Gospels are reliable to begin with, to even say that he did indeed heal.
That evidence demonstrated, they attested to his divinity. That's an evidential approach. I want to read you something out of Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 28. John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus because...
Yeah, Todd Beard, great point. At this point, if this is his testimony, which I think you're going to hear later on that this isn't his testimony of why he's a Christian today. None of this forensic stuff is the reason why he's a Christian today, I think. And you're going to hear it coming up. Did he at any point do that horizontal thing that Bart Ehrman talks about? Look at Luke, look at Matthew, look at Mark, and read it horizontally and say, well, wait a minute. We got some, we won't call them contradictions, but we got some frictions here on what exactly happened that day.
Because John is now in captivity, he's in custody, and he wants to know, is Jesus the one? So he sends his disciples to Jesus.
Richard Meyer has asked, am I trying to make money with PineCreek? I am monetized, but I have never asked for money. I don't have a Patreon account. I've never asked for a like or a subscribe. This is a hobby of mine. Do you also not suffer from confirmation bias? Yes, we all do. Every single person. And so the real issue is, how do we lower it? And the best way, in my opinion, to lower biases is to you get a whole bunch of biases together, people of different backgrounds, different cultures, and you pour them in a pot and you take a big spoon and you mix all the biases together, and then you look at the evidence and you see, okay, do we agree on X? All these different biases, all these different cultures. And if we do, then you can say, raise your confidence. Well, maybe what we are saying here, what we're seeing here, is based on something true. Now, try that with religion. Try getting Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Mormons, evangelical Christians, Catholic Christians, Calvinist Christians. Try to get them all in that vat and stir it about and see if they come to the same conclusion. You only see this type of solidarity to certain conclusions from a vast array of different biases on very hard scientific type facts. This is why science, I think, has flourished in the last few hundred years.
And when the men had come to him, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, are you the one, the coming one? Or do we look for another? Imagine Jesus is listening to this from John. This is what I would have said. Really? John, my cousin, wants to know this? John, the guy who leapt in the womb when our mothers met? John, the one who baptized me and saw the Spirit of God descend on me at the baptism? That's the guy. He saw them. John, the one...
saw the Spirit descend. I'm just wondering if in J. Warner Wallace's history, when he's going through a cold case and he reads some type of evidence report of someone saying, oh yeah, I was there, corner of 3rd Street and 4th Avenue or whatever, and and there was this guy who was about to rob a bank, but I saw a spirit descend on him just before he went in to rob the bank. J. Warner Wallace, are you going to say, yeah, that I can buy that. That probably happened. Or would you look at this witness and say, you saw a spirit descend on him? Really? What? I thought spirits were intangible. They weren't made up of stuff. How did you see this? But you put it in a Bible 2,000 years ago, well, then it becomes believable.
One who sent all of you guys to me. You realize, by the way, all of your guys are with me now, okay? You 3 guys are coming from John, are the last ones over there, okay? Everybody else is over here. This is the guy who wants to know if I'm the one? Remember, when you're talking as a detective, you're not just listening to what people say to you, but...
By the way, alias fake name Wallace blocked me. Yeah, I think J. Warner Wallace blocks anybody who is not a Christian. He blocked me very early on Twitter, and if you look here, it says comments are turned off. I think every video he has, he turns off comments, and he basically does not want to interact with, personally anyhow, I don't think he doesn't want to interact with anybody who's a non-Christian, except for maybe his own family who are Mormon. But, Mormons are Christian too,
But what they could say, but don't. So I'm thinking, what could Jesus say in response to this? He could say, tell John he needs to pray about this. He needs to have a little more faith. That's not what he does. You know what he does, right? says right here, at that very hour, he cured many of infirmities, afflictions, and evil spirits, and to many blind he gave sight. Then he said, go back and tell John what you just saw. That's an evidentialist. The reason why...
That's an evidentialist. But you're assuming that that actually happened. Here's the problem. Like if I were to say, last week, I healed someone, an amputee, in the name of Vishnu. And it worked. I prayed to Vishnu, and he heard my prayer, and I even wrote it down. I can show you my journal. Do you believe me, J. Warner Wallace? Like your initial gut reaction, yes, that happened. Of course not. You don't believe that for 1 second. But for some, why do you believe it when it's put in a book that's 2,000 years old?
Why I don't give my testimony typically is because
well, here it comes. Okay. So remember, he's talking about forensics, but now he's getting back to the main point of this video, why he doesn't give his testimony. So it's obvious that him talking about the forensics is not part of his testimony, because he does that all the time, talks about the forensic cold case type evidence.
The reason why I don't give my testimony typically is because when I ask people around the country, why are you a Christian? I wrote a book on this called Forensic Faith. I get the same two answers. The most popular answer in the country for why you are a Christian is, I was raised that way.
Which does not apply to him. He was not raised a Christian.
That is the most popular answer. The second one, there's a big gap, is I've had an experience that demonstrated for me that Christianity is true.
I had an experience that demonstrated. Now, we know the first one doesn't apply to him, because I believe him when he says he was raised in an atheistic type home. But he's saying all this to say, I don't talk about my personal testimony. Why? Because people say they were born and raised in it, and that's a terrible reason, in his opinion. Even though it's the right reason, that it could be the true reason, but don't say the true reason, because it's horrible. Because then you've got to say, well, the reason why Hindus are Hindus and Muslims are Muslims are because they were raised in it. And if we start saying stuff like that, then we realize, oh man, the reasons we have are not good, and maybe we should let it go. And so maybe for J. Warner Wallace, he had a moment in his life when his wife took him to church and said, hey, we've got to have community because we have a young family. I am imagining, it'd be so sweet if I'm right about this. I'm imagining that near the point of his conversion, J. Warner Wallace was bawling like a baby in church with the music playing in the background, with maybe a pastor, an elder, laying on hands on him or talking, just praying with him. And he just totally broke down and he wept like a child. I would not be surprised if he had some type of experience like that, very close to his conversion. And he felt God, that he thought was God, in a real powerful way. And it fulfilled a psychological need in him that he thought at first, this is just for pragmatics, I'm just going to go to church for community. But then he had this experience. I tell you, I would not be surprised that this is what happened, even to a guy like him he looks like, he's more the stoic type. I'm a stoic type too, but I remember times when I was a Christian where I was going through a hard time. I remember sitting in my room on the floor with my Bible open, and just the tears were rolling down so heavy that it would wet my, the pages of my Bible would get all wet and soggy. And those were the times when my confidence that Jesus was real and God was real, the Bible was true, all these things, my confidence was at its peak during those moments. And I bet you that's what happened to him, and that's what happens to so many Christians, Muslims, doesn't matter what religion you're in. That's when you feel the closest to your deity. That's when you think it's the most true, when you're most confident, is the times of your deepest need.
And your experiences are different, right? There, you prayed a prayer that you saw an answer, you saw a miracle, you felt God's presence in your life at some critical time, whatever it may be. Those are the two most popular answers. My dad's not a believer, but his second wife, who he married in the 60s, 1964 or so, is LDS. She's a Mormon. I have 6 half-brothers and sisters, all raised Mormon.
Yeah, this, to me, must cause so much cognitive dissonance in him. If he has 6 half-brothers or half-sisters who are Mormon, he realizes that you cannot go by personal experience alone. You cannot say X is true because I've experienced X happen to me. He's a smart enough guy to realize this, but yet I am very confident that this is what happened to him. Because he's admitting this is why he's not sharing this information, because it's a bad way, it's a bad testimony. It's a bad way at arriving at truth.
If you ask my half-brothers and sisters, why are you Mormon? They will say, because I was raised in the church, and I had an experience of the Holy Spirit that demonstrated for me the Book of Mormon is true and Joseph Smith's a prophet of God. You don't believe that their answers are enough, do you?
No, we don't. We don't believe their answer is enough. And neither do we take Joseph Smith's word for it when he writes in his diary that Jesus talked to him personally. Right? J. Warner Wallace does not believe that for 1 second, that Jesus himself talked to Joseph Smith and said, by the way, all that past Christianity stuff, it's wrong. Let me tell you the real Christianity. J. Warner Wallace doesn't believe that actually happened. But yet, Joseph Smith says this is what happened to him. But you put this in the New Testament, and you say it happened on the road to Damascus to a guy named Paul, or Saul, who became Paul, then it's believable. But not when it happens to a guy named Joseph Smith. And don't give me all this stuff about, Joseph Smith, he was a con artist and blah, blah, blah. If all you knew was the stuff that Joseph Smith wrote or that his followers wrote, which is the case we have for Jesus, if all we knew is that stuff and none of that bad stuff from outsiders, if all we had was the good stuff that Joseph Smith wrote and his followers wrote, you, for 1 second, couldn't say anything bad about him. You couldn't say he was a con man. Couldn't say he was a shyster. Because what if they just destroyed all that other evidence that they didn't like in the first century?
Why would anybody believe that our answers, if they're just going to be, I was raised in the church and I've had this experience, should be enough? I don't think Jesus intended it that way. That word testimony that we use all the time, that word testimony is used most often in the book of Acts, but it's never somebody telling another person what their experience with Jesus was, how Jesus changed their life. You show me where that is in the book of Acts. No, they're testifying about the resurrection as eyewitnesses of the resurrection.
Yeah, and would it be nice as a detective that if you have evidence, you know who wrote it? Well, who wrote this? We don't know. Well, when was it written? We don't know. We can make some guesses. This is what we have for the case of the New Testament, except for Paul's letters. Well, even some people doubt that Paul wrote half of what Paul wrote.
That's why they chose Matthias after Judas, because he was somebody who had seen Jesus from the baptism to the resurrection, Acts 1. So I was at a Boise event about 3 weeks ago, big campus event. We're showing the evidence for Christianity, and someone at the very back of the room raised their hand. She stood up. She said, okay, you told us all that evidence, but can you just share your testimony? And here's what I told her. I said, you know what? People ask me that all the time, and I'm just going to tell you right now, my testimony does not matter. And
my testimony does not matter. And he cannot be talking about his testimony of the cold case evidence type evidence. Because he talks about that all the time. So that's clearly not his testimony. So his testimony probably is that he had some amazing experience, which he admits is not a reliable way to come into truth.
Either is yours. Here's what matters. Is it true? And can I demonstrate that it's true by talking about the evidence for it? So, folks, as I leave you this morning, we've got young people in the church.
Yeah, and imagine a Mormon, and this is what must eat J. Warner Wallace up inside, because a Mormon could say something very similar to this.
Money does not matter. And either is yours. Here's what matters. Is it true? And can I demonstrate that it's true?
And can I demonstrate that it's true? I bet you that J. Warner Wallace's in-laws, or half-sisters, half-brothers, who are Mormon, can say, yes, I can demonstrate that it's true. J. Warner Wallace is not a stupid guy. He realizes there's Mormon apologists, just like he's a Christian apologist. And that they believe it so strongly that they can take the evidence and show that it all can fit together like pieces in a puzzle. Sure, there might be some frictions here and there, but we can harmonize these things, says the Mormon. Sure, we don't have all the evidence yet, but hey, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? Right, Christians?
By talking about the evidence for it. So, folks, as I leave you this morning, we've got young people in the church. We are hemorrhaging young people. Gen Z is 3 times.
If Christianity, if evangelical Christianity, if his version of Christianity is false, I wonder if a guy like Jerry Warner Wallace could say, well, maybe hemorrhaging young people is a good thing. If it's false, we want people to leave Christianity then. See, but this is the problem. Evangelical Christians like J. Warner Wallace says, no, we have the truth. We are standing on the bedrock of truth. There is absolutely no way any of this is wrong. The core fundamentals, the core propositions of Christianity is true, flat out true. Jesus is the truth. But if you're a Christian who thinks and talks this way, I only have one question for you. Do you think it's reasonable for a person who values truth to at least consider the idea that they may not currently possess it?
It's more likely to be an atheist than Gen X. Forget about millennials in the middle.
What's so bad about being an atheist? I think it boils down to carrots and sticks, heaven and hell.
It's time for us now to be able to answer the most important questions that Gen Z asks. 7 in 10, when they say they walk away from the church, will say they walked away because they do not believe it's evidentially true. The other 3 will say, I've had a relationship issue, hypocrisy in the church, whatever. But 7 of 10 will say, I don't believe it's evidential.
I've been saying this for years. I think I've always said it's at least half. But this is the real problem that Christian apologists have. Because they kind of I think Christian apologists want, oh, you just have daddy issues. They want that to be the reason. Or, oh, you were hurt in the church. Oh, yeah, those hypocrites in the church, that's why you left. They want that to be true. Because when they hear that the reason why the Christian youth are leaving Christianity is because they don't believe the core propositions, that just because the Bible says something, that doesn't mean that it actually happened in the past. That if we had a video camera 2,000 years ago, we wouldn't record Jesus dividing the loaves and fishes to feed the 5,000. We wouldn't record that. It didn't happen if we had that video camera 2,000 years ago. The Christian youth who are leaving, they don't believe that would have ever been on film. This is a huge problem. They're basically saying, just because the text says it doesn't mean it happened.
Actually true. We could actually fix that. Because we do not need another $1 million Christian apologist. We need $1 million $1 Christian apologists. We need all of us to do the work. Your kids are looking for answers, and you are the best Christian apologist they're ever going to know. They're going to go to you first. They're not going to...
No. Well, they might go to you first. Some of them might. But if you're a Christian parent who's my age or older, I tell you, odds are you don't have a clue. You don't have a clue. Well, J. Warner Wallace would probably agree with me here and say, well, that's why you need to buy my books. But I can guarantee you that your kids know what you're going to answer before you even think it. They know what you're going to say before you even think it. And they know both sides of the issue. If they care about this stuff, I'm assuming they do because they're, should I stay a Christian or not? They've probably done way more research and know what guys like Warner Wallace is going to say. And guess what? They're still not buying it. The problem with Christianity is not that the Christian youth haven't heard answers. The problem isn't that they have questions and their questions haven't been answered. That is not the problem for evangelical Christianity. The problem is they have heard the answers and they're not buying it.
Going to read my stupid books. They're going to ask you, why is this true? I just want to encourage you to start to take a step in that direction to be able to defend what you believe. We're called to do that, by the way. This is what Edward talked about in 1 Peter 3:15. Can you give a reason for the hope you have in Jesus? We're asked to do that. Let's pray.
Yeah. Okay, someone in the live stream chat asked about personal experiences with, I have never done a video on this guy. What was his name? Nabil Qureshi? Is that his name? Who passed away a while back? Yeah, Nabil Qureshi. I've listened to his testimony. Maybe I have done a video on him. Maybe a clip. But number one, he was a, what do you call it? He wasn't a Sunni. He wasn't a Shia. Mrs. Apostate, if you're still in here, you probably know. Ahmadiyya, is that how you pronounce it? And he met David Wood, and he was in a Christian culture, and he had some, I guess, serious doubts about his version of Islam. He started to make friends and community with Christians, and then he started having dreams that he thought, wow, this dream must mean Christianity is true. If you listen to his testimony, it's not about evidence for Nabil. It was that he had this vision or dream. I think S.J. Thompson's in this chat. Same thing for her. She talks about over and over again all the evidence for Christianity, but really the key reason why she's a Christian is because of a vision or dream that she had. But this, in my opinion, is a horrible, terrible, unreliable, inconsistent way to come to something, to believe something is true, especially something that is so important. But for so many people, and this is what Warner Wallace is saying here, he's basically telling Christians to shut up about your testimony. Be quiet. Because whatever you say about your testimony, odds are every religion has said something similar. So just keep your mouth shut about your testimony and just talk about the things that are in my book. But that leads us back to confirmation bias. There was another video that he made. Why should I believe in a resurrection when it's not part of our common experience? This gets to miracles, I think. Now, I think the audio is a little bad on this one, but I think it's very interesting.
Ken asked this question. He said, you appropriately use forensic tools based on common experience. Okay. For example, that conspiracy theories are rarely tenable, let's say 99% of the time, yet common experience also tells us that people who die stay dead 99.99999% of the time. Shouldn't we then have the humility to question our confidence in the less than 100% certain arguments we use to build a case for such an unlikely conclusion?
Okay, this whole question I thought was a brilliant question. It's basically having to do with prior probability. So you can believe God is real. You can believe Yahweh is real. You can believe miracles can happen. But the bottom line is, and for the Christians who love natural theology, that we have this orderly world We have uniformity that is an expression, a reflection of the nature of God, that we can do science. If it wasn't for this natural theology, we couldn't even do science. And so, but we know that in our common everyday experience, that people just don't walk on water. We know from our everyday common experience, if there's no trickery involved, that people don't just rise from the dead, especially if they've been dead for like days. We know in our common experience this is the case. So, now, if miracles are possible, then maybe it does happen, but we know that doesn't happen very often. In fact, very, very seldom. That's one of the definitions of a miracle. So shouldn't we take this into account, this prior probability? Shouldn't we take this into account when we're reading New Testament texts?
So a couple of things. Every case we build, we never use percentages. We never allow jurors to talk in percentages. They'll ask us sometimes, what percentage do I need to be at to be beyond a reasonable doubt? Like, is that like 75% sure? Well, first of all,
in a jury situation, in a court situation, you never talk about percentages, really? Like even DNA analysis, don't they say the chances are that this is not the person, 1 in 1 billion or something like that? That's, that's odds, but still, you can convert that to percentages. I don't buy this for 1 second.
How in the world will we calculate that percentage? Yeah, we could say it's 99% of the time or 99.9999% of the time. We could say that, but how exactly are we arriving at that percentage point? I mean, in some communities, people would say,
how can you arrive at a percentage point for the resurrection? Well, you can do some rough guesses. You could ask the Christian, okay, we've got 7 billion people on the planet. What percentage of in history do we have of resurrection claims? And what percentage of them, just your gut, what's your gut? It's not reliable, but what's your gut instinct say, what percentage of them actually happened? See, I have a feeling a guy like J. Warner Wallace, if you gave him 100 resurrection miracle claims that happened this past year, over the last 12 months, I don't even know if there would be 100, but let's say there were 100 claims. Ask J. Warner Wallace, how many of those 100 do you think actually happened, where a person was actually dead and then came back to life after several days, not just like 20 minutes or something? I'm guessing he would say none. But maybe he's the type of guy, he's like the Michael Brown type. So, oh yeah, that happens all the time in Africa. But, in the West, God doesn't, people are too closed-minded, so God doesn't work that way in the West. But yeah, in those third world countries, it happens all the time. I doubt if J. Warner Wallace is that type of apologist, but maybe he is.
Actually, and I wouldn't agree with this, I'm just saying that some people would say, hey, I think miraculous stuff happens 60% of the time. So is that really? I mean, so how are we going to, because your experience tells you this and my experience says something. That's why we stay away from percentages. In the end, we're trying to eliminate things that are simply possible and try to focus on those things that are reasonable. Now, look,
reasonable, I think what he meant to say is probable. We don't just focus on the what's possible or not possible. We focus on, well, if it's impossible, then we can discard it. But we focus on what's probable. Now, if you're leaving yourself open as a detective to miracle claims, you remember that woman who drowned her, was it 4, 5, 6 kids, 3 kids, I don't know, in Texas? And she claimed that the reason why she drowned her kids is because God told her to. Because if those kids would have grown up, God told her, the mother, that if they would have grown up, those kids, they would have not become Christians and they would have gone to hell. But they were, in her mind, before the age of accountability. So if she killed her kids, they would go to heaven. Just like, all those kids during the days of Noah went to heaven. A lot of evangelicals believe. Now, she's on the witness stand. And she looks at J. Warner Wallace in the eyes and says, God told me this. He told me to drown my own kids. Do you believe her, J. Warner Wallace? And if not, why not? What if she's telling the truth? What if God actually did this and told her to drown her own kids, just like he told Noah to build a boat because a big flood is coming, and that God was going to, in that case, God actively did the drowning himself. But in this case, he had a woman do it.
If you, up front, you've said...
Andrea Yates. Yeah, thank you, Joy Bradford. Like, if you are a Christian who believes in miracles that happen today, if you're a Christian who believes in revelation, that God speaks to people today, S.J. Thompson is in here. She believes, I think, God spoke to her at one point in her life. Jesus spoke to her. If Jesus can speak to people today, Jesus can say things like, I want you to do X, I want you to do Y. And as a faithful follower of Jesus, and if it's truly Jesus saying these things, then you better do what Jesus says. And so if Jesus says, drown your kids, and there's precedent for this. God told Abraham to chop off the head of Isaac. But he stopped him, right? But in this case, Jesus didn't stop Andrea Yates.
I could never accept any supernatural or extra-natural cause as reasonable.
Now, you remember the question? The question basically said, no, miracles are possible, even if it's a small percentage. And look what J. Warner Wallace does here.
Well, now look, if you, up front, you've said that I could never accept any supernatural or extra-natural cause.
Yeah, I don't know if he's talking about the guy who wrote this question, this letter, but he did not say that.
As reasonable. Okay. Then you're not going to accept this explanation. No problem. That's why we do such basically a diligent job of selecting juries. We want to make sure that we don't have somebody who says, hey, I could never be persuaded that this guy is your suspect.
Yeah, he's saying this is why we are very careful in who we select for juries. So, J. Warner Wallace, would you be okay with a jury member on one of your murder cases saying, oh yeah, I'm totally open to Andrea Yates, that Jesus spoke to her through revelation, telling her to do a good thing, to kill her children for morally sufficient reasons, to prevent them from going to hell for eternity. What's more morally sufficient than that? Like, would you want that type of jury member who's open to that idea to be on on your jury? Or it's like this whole idea. He's painting this picture like, oh yeah, if you're not open to miracles, yeah, you're just like those closed-minded jury members who, no matter what, they're just so stubborn, they're not gonna see any evidence, no matter what you do.
He looks just like me. Or I could never be persuaded that he isn't the suspect because he looks like somebody who would kill somebody. We want those people off our jury because we need people who are not so fixed in their position that they aren't even open to the reasonable explanation offered by any other side.
Yeah. Are you open to a reasonable explanation that maybe the New Testament was written using the Old Testament as a template, and that maybe 60, 70, 80% of the stuff that records Jesus doing, are you open to the idea that maybe it never, ever, ever happened in the past, and that the New Testament authors penned it in? Are you open to that reasonable explanation? Or do you think it's more reasonable that someone can walk on water? Which is more reasonable to you? This is why guys like J. Warner Wallace work so hard to write books, to build the confidence of Christians, because they realize the question I just asked is a death knell. It's just like the Christian youth are leaving in droves because they realize that question and the answer to the question is so incredibly reasonable that authors used texts to create a new narrative, and that this is more storytelling than anything. Michael Licona just admitted the other day that, yeah, the New Testament, the Gospels, are a type of propaganda. They had an agenda. I forget what video he said that in. I think it was on Capturing Christianity's channel. He admitted, yeah, the authors of the New Testament, they had a goal to build the confidence of Christian followers. They were biased. Now that they could still be telling the truth. But when you have people admitting that, hey, yeah, we're biased, our goal is to save souls for Jesus, you got to take a step back and say, okay, let's be careful now.
This is true for defense attorneys and for prosecutors. So in the end, if we're somebody who says, hey, I have to be at 100% certainty, or I think up front that the supernatural could be ruled out 99.99999% of the time.
I bet you J. Warner Wallace believes that. I think that number is probably pretty consistent for him. I think he would say 99.9% of the time, miracles don't happen. I think he's a pretty reasonable guy if you were to just ask him point blank, like 1,000 miracle claims, how many of them do you think actually were really from God, and how much do you think is just in people's minds?
Well, we don't know that. That's the thing we're investigating. That's the thing we're trying to determine. And I think what happens here is that every case has more than enough evidence, every case I've ever worked and put in front of a jury, has more than enough evidence for the jury to conclude, to render a verdict. Yet, there's always enough wiggle room for a juror to hang or to say, I'm not going to agree. That's the nature of every case. There's more than enough evidence to draw an inference, but there's also enough wiggle room for somebody to say, I refuse to draw an inference. This is also the case for God, is that there's...
So I wonder what percent confidence J. Warner Wallace is at. He's admitting here that you don't need 100% certainty, which I admire. I think you would have to be omniscient to get 100% true knowledge. But anyhow, I wonder, J. Warner Wallace, Christianity, is it true or not? What's your confidence level? Are you at 90%? 99? 80? Like Michael Licona, is that 80%? Do you give yourself 20% wiggle room with your eyewitness accounts? 10% wiggle room? Do you admit that maybe 0 of this is eyewitness accounts? What percentage would you put on that? 5%? Are you open to the idea, or are you like those closed-minded jurors?
There's more than enough evidence to reasonably infer that God exists, but there's also enough wiggle room for people to deny it. And I think that God wants it that way. I think that this is why we don't have we have a God who's a gentleman who's not going to compel belief.
God is a gentleman who doesn't compel belief. He's saying this is why God gave wiggle room. Does Satan, Lucifer, I'm quite sure J. Warner Wallace believes in Satan or Lucifer. Is there wiggle room in Lucifer's mind, according to your worldview, that God exists or not? Did God give him wiggle room? No. In the Christian worldview, the idea of Yahweh can be so clear to every human being on the planet. The specific nature of this deity can be so clear, and they still would have the free will to follow this God or not, just like Satan did and his minions, right? This is an old argument that Christians throw about that, the evidence can't be too good, because if it was, then God didn't want to take away the free will of humans. All you have to do is bring up angels and demons, and you can see that doesn't fly.
Because then it wouldn't really be belief. I mean, there's an act of freedom involved in even deciding which is the most reasonable inference. And if I remove that freedom from you by either overwhelming you or by designing you in such a way that you have no choice but to believe one thing or the other, you could call this love, you could call this faith, you could call this belief, but really it's just a pre-programmed, overwhelmed kind of compulsion that that God has put on you. So I think that what we have here is that every case, yes, if you think that there's enough wiggle room to deny these claims, absolutely there is. And can I remove that wiggle room for you? No. And so I'm pretty calm about that. Mm-hmm. My job is to show to the jury. I never say I'm going to prove this to you. Now, my attorneys sometimes say that, but I would never say that.
Gotcha.
I'm going to make a case for this. It may prove it to you, but proof is in the eye of the considerer, or in the head of the considerer. And so I may not be able to prove it to you because that's something that your definition of proof may be so high.
I don't disagree with what he's saying right here. It's like what convinces people is very subjective.
I need a 100% certainty, for example, that I'm never going to reach that. I've never reached 100% certainty in any case I've ever tried.
Are you at 100% certainty with Christianity? because you tried Christianity as a case as well, right? So he's admitting here, I think, that he's not 100% confident that Christianity is true.
Gotcha.
Okay, let's do one more here. What is the best historical evidence for Christianity? Oh, this should be good. This is only 3 minutes long.
What is the best historical evidence I think this is a good question for the audience as a whole. What's the best historical evidence you can give for the Christian faith?
The best I'm not a big fan of that word historical. So what I look at, remember, everything we work in cold cases, we're working, any crime you're working in a...
What? He's not a fan of the word historical? That's surprising. What? I literally have not watched this one before. I watched the other two, but not this one. What? Why did he say that?
Event in the past. We don't get to watch crimes in live time. We're not like scientists who work in a laboratory environment with crime. We are always examining events. I guess you could call them historical events, even if it's only 30 years ago or it's only 30 minutes ago. So what we're looking at is, do we have any good evidence that would, so for example, the first thing I wanted to know when I was looking at the New Testament is, could I reasonably consider the Gospels to be a reliable eyewitness record? That's up for debate, and people will debate that for ages, okay? And I've written...
Why is it up for debate if it's so conclusive beyond a reasonable doubt, in your opinion?
A ton about this in both.
See, this is the beauty of Camille's question on find us a historian who was not a Christian, who looked at the evidence for Christianity, the historical evidence, and became a Christian because of it. Who was a professional historian who really understands how to do history. And you can't find it.
My books and on the website. And what I try to argue is that I think we've got good reason to at least suggest that the authors of this account wanted it to be considered an eyewitness account. We have statements like John at the end of his account where he says, hey, I'm writing about all that Jesus did. I could write a lot more. I could fill books with all this stuff. Okay. Then the question is, well, is it a reliable account?
Yeah, and guys like Michael Licona, even Craig Keener, who believes in miracles like crazy, will say, no, they made up stuff in the Gospel of John.
Is it an account, an eyewitness account, and then is it a reliable account? And if it's a reliable account, this is how, by the way, I get supplemental reports from 30 years ago in which a witness has been interviewed by a detective in 1972. Now, that witness has been dead for 10 years. So I have no way to go re-interview that person. And the detective has been dead for 5. So now I have no way to go interview the writer of the report. But I've got this report I have to assess, even though I have no access to the first eyewitness or the person who wrote about the eyewitness. That's much like the guy.
See, this is a great point. He's admitting that he cannot interview the people who saw what they saw. He cannot interview the people who wrote what they wrote. But in today's cases, you can, as long as they're alive. You can actually sit down with them and interview them, talk to them. Now, this is a point, like when Christians are triggered by the phrase, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, this is the sort of thing we're talking about. And Christians agree with that phrase. They really do. They just differ on the terminology. You can say, well, big evidence requires big claims require big evidence and so forth. We have a claim of a man rise from the dead, walking on water, being God in flesh, all these things, all these big claims. But J. Warner Wallace is admitting here that we cannot interview these people about these claims. Can't even interview Jesus. In all throughout history, those claims are big about Jesus. Those are big claims. But all throughout history, we have way better evidence than what we have for Jesus. We have people that we can sit down with and talk to, hook them up to lie detector tests, interview them over a course of a month to see if their stories stick. We could do forensics as well. We can do so many things that is better evidence than what we have for Jesus. But yet, the claim for Jesus is still big. That hasn't changed. This is the mismatch between big claims and little evidence. if J. Warner Wallace's wife was accused of murder, and J. Warner Wallace says, well, who's accusing her? Well, we don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, someone just accused her of murder. Well, who? Well, we just found this diary. It says that she did it. Well, who wrote the diary? We don't know. Well, when was it written? We don't know. Where was it written? We don't know. But it says clearly that your wife committed the murder. Well, come on, says J. Warner Wallace. You're gonna believe that major claim that could affect her life? She could go to jail forever until she dies, based on some scribbles on paper? Well, yeah, this is the case we have with Jesus. Oh, I'm being accused of straw manning so hard right now, I bet.
Gospels. Well, I know how to assess those reports. There's 4 factors. I talk about them in cold case. 4 factors we use to assess eyewitness reliability of any document, of any eyewitness. So those 4 areas are the 4 areas that I pressed into service as I examine the Gospels. So for me, remember, when someone asks you, what is the one reason why you believe this to be true, I'm always a little bit hesitant because I never have one reason. I call this death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah, a cumulative case. And for all the non-Christians listening, the way you deal with people like J. Warner Wallace who talk about the cumulative case is you come up with a hypothetical big claim, a hypothetical big claim, like I did with Inspiring Philosophy, and he failed miserably at this. He just backpedaled like crazy. You take the big claim and say, on its own, that's all you know, do you believe it? Do you believe, if all you knew is Jesus rose from the dead, that's all you knew. It says in a book. That's all you know. Do you believe it? Your answer has to be no. If you're consistent with all the other claims in the world and so forth, and if you're intellectually honest with yourself. And now let's layer in the cumulative case step by step. And do that for the hypothetical case. I always use the flying man. Oh, it says in a book that 500 people saw the flying man fly unaided. Do you believe it now? No, that could be made up. Okay. So you don't believe it just because it says that he could fly. You don't believe it if it says there was 500 witnesses. Do you believe it if there was like 4 different diaries that said the man flew? Well, no, because they could have been just feeding off each other. And I tell you, that cumulative case, each part of the cumulative case has to stand up on its own, at least a little bit, right? And if you can just easily dismiss it with the hypothetical flying man, you don't have a cumulative case. You have cumulative excuses to believe what you want to believe.
That's what it is. It's this cumulative case of hundreds of little things that I think point to the most reasonable inference. And any one of those things is a paper cut. I could offer it to you, and I think you could be very reasonably say, well, that doesn't seem like enough. It's not enough. It's the fact it's cumulative. It wouldn't be enough in a jury trial either. But when I get 100 of these things, juries convict.
Ki says, this person's kind of beyond my comprehension, honestly. I don't know how someone can be so confidently deluded. Let me see if I can... My guess is, Kai, you've never been raised in a Christian or a religious household. You haven't experienced it. For those who haven't, let me see if I can tell you how it's possible. And I'm going to assume the best here of J. Warner Wallace. I'm not assuming he's just doing this for the money and that he's just doing this for the book sales and he doesn't really believe this. I'm going to assume that he believes this with all his being. I think what happens is that when you first start out with this experience, which I guessed at earlier in this live stream, that was so powerful and real to them, that when you have that as your base, which has happened to guys like Michael Licona when he talks about the flying trash can lids and his personal experiences of angels and demons or whatever, these spiritual type experiences. When you're starting at that, then you see, when you open up the Bible and you read it, you're seeing it through that lens of, oh yeah, I believe these things happened to me, so I can believe that this happened 2,000 years ago. And once you get stuck in that mindset that you're like 99% sure that no, this cannot be just coincidence. This was God acting in my life in 1994, and I remember it like it was yesterday. And when you get stuck in that mindset, and if you're getting your community, and in this case, J. Warner Wallace is getting his income from this, but when you're getting this rich, full community supporting you in your day-to-day walk of just trying to survive on this planet, I tell you, it's really hard to allow yourself to doubt this stuff. When you get your meaning and purpose, this whole idea of morality, and will I really be a good person if I leave Christianity, and what's the point of it all if this is not true? Like, some people even say they should just off themselves. Like, if you're coming from that perspective, it is incredibly easy, Kai, to see how they can believe this so strongly. And in fact, they themselves, Christians like J. Warner Wallace, they themselves can see it in other religions like Mormons. Like, he can see that in his family. And why they believe Mormonism when it's just so ridiculous. But yet they still believe it. Like, it's just, it can't be false. But they can't turn it around. They can't look in the mirror and see it in themselves.
Because there's no other reasonable alternative. And that's what I tried to do with Cold Case Christianity. That book is really about looking at the historical evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. I know that's not going to give you much. So
no, it wasn't for me.
Give me a chance to recite 48,000 words, and I can give it to you right now.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. I appreciate
thank
it.
you, sir.
Appreciate you. Thanks so much for watching our video. If it was helpful and useful to you, I'd really appreciate it if you would follow us, subscribe to our channel at the bottom link here in the video, and tell your friends. And please follow us on social media.
Yeah, follow us, but don't comment, because comments are turned off. Is that, yeah, comments are turned off here too. How does he talk to his people? If he doesn't, does he interact with Christians via Twitter at all? I don't know. So I think he must have had an amazing experience at some point in his life, because he admitted he doesn't talk about his testimony because it's probably not about the evidence. If you came late, watch that first part. And you know what's interesting about this? Especially apologists like J. Warner Wallace, Lee Strobel, those guys will talk about how they kind of dove into this critically, examined all the evidence, came to the conclusion that Christianity is true. But I bet you 10,000 pine points their wives did not do this. And they, for 1 second, wouldn't badmouth their epistemology of their wives. Which tells you something. It tells you that they are okay with people believing stuff for bad reasons. Now, I'm making assumptions here. I could be wrong. But did Lee Strobel's wife go deep into the evidence like Lee Strobel did for 2 years? I doubt it. Maybe Lee Strobel told her what he was finding, but... And I bet you J. Warner Wallace's wife, when he's talking about all this cold case stuff and eyewitness accounts and so forth, I wonder if his wife just looks at him and says, I just experienced Jesus. I just love Jesus. I don't care what your books say. Sure, it's nice that we have evidence, or that type of evidence, but hey, I don't need it. Guys like J. Warner Wallace are doing what they're doing because so many people are feeling stupid for what they believe, and they need to find reasons to stay in it. Well, Mike Winger said it himself, the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit is the primary evidence for Christianity. Did you talk about Nabil Qureshi also? Yeah, earlier on in this live stream I did, Mrs. Apostate. I basically was saying that he was a Ahmadiyya type Muslim, which is way different than, I think, regular Sunni or Shia Islam. I've interviewed a few Ahmadiyya type Muslims, but I think if you investigate Nabil's story, his testimony, he didn't come to Christianity because of the evidence. He came to Christianity because of a dream. Sunk cost, yes, J.I. person. When you spend so many years believing something, investing your time in the community on a certain belief, to doubt it, to give it up, it's just too costly. It's just... This is why so many atheists, I think, are bitter and angry. It's like they feel that a big chunk of their life has been wasted. Good question, John Camacho. How do you tell the difference between the Holy Spirit really interacting with you versus you just think the Holy Spirit is, but really isn't? Rhett and Link had someone who wrote a pushback piece on their deconstruction admit that he doesn't believe it either. Oh my. I think I'm going to start telling people to go to PineCreek Church. It's YouTube only. Yes, in my church, you're free to doubt all you want. Doubt meaning question. No tithing. Do atheists have any sunk costs in staying atheists? Good question. I think some do, I'm sure, especially those who do it for a living. I think I speak for many atheists when I say that in a lot of ways my life could be easier, my wife would be happier if I could convince myself that Christianity is true. So if I do have a bias, if anything, it is towards Christianity. I think that a lot of atheists are in my shoes. It only took one agnostic in my family to get me to think for myself. Good point, Donnie H. Like if a Christian's listening to this live stream right now, they're going to dismiss me pretty quickly. But if someone they love, a relative, says something similar to what I've said here today, they're more likely to listen to that person because they have a relationship with that person. They love that person. They respect that person. A Mormon will say they're feeling something that just couldn't have come from within themselves, and that's how they know it was the Spirit. Yep. Not only Mormons say that. Don't stay away so long, Doug. We want more. My apologies to J. Warner Wallace. He was scheduled to come on and defend himself, but we ran out of time. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. Have a great evening. Take care. I'll try to be back sooner next time.